Commander Zexthera adjusted the neural interface crown on her elongated skull, feeling the familiar tingle as the recording systems came online. The sleek observation vessel Silent Watcher hung in the void between star systems, its advanced stealth technology rendering it invisible to the primitive sensors of the warring species below. As the Galactic Council's premier combat analyst, she had observed hundreds of conflicts across dozens of worlds. But this assignment felt different. The humans had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, yet somehow they had managed to insert themselves into one of the most brutal territorial disputes in this sector. The Korthak Empire and the Velan Confederacy had been locked in a savage war for over 2 decades, their advanced fleets reducing entire planets to ash and debris. Now these newcomers, these barely evolved primates from a backwater world called Earth, had somehow convinced both sides to accept their military assistance. Zexthera's mandibles clicked in what her species considered amusement. The Council had specifically chosen her for this mission because of her experience with primitive species. They wanted detailed recordings of how quickly the humans would be eliminated, data that would help determine if Earth posed any future threat to galactic stability. The betting pools on the Council stations were already heavily weighted toward complete human annihilation within the first standard day of combat. She activated the long-range scanners and began cycling through various electromagnetic frequencies, searching for the human fleet. According to intelligence reports, they had arrived in system 3 days ago with a modest force of 12 vessels. Compared to the thousands of ships each major faction could field, it was laughably inadequate. The humans claimed they were here as peacekeepers, a concept that had caused considerable confusion among the Council's linguists. The scanner array finally locked onto the human formation, and Zexthera's secondary heart skipped a beat. The ships were unlike anything in the galactic database. Where most civilized species built sleek, efficient vessels with smooth curves and integrated weapon systems, the human ships looked like they had been assembled by scavengers. Angular hull sections jutted out at irregular intervals, massive engines dominated the rear thirds of each vessel, and what appeared to be crude armor plating covered every surface. She magnified the image and began taking detailed scans. The largest vessel, presumably their flagship, measured approximately 800 meters in length. Its hull bore scars and patches that suggested extensive battle damage, yet the humans had simply welded additional plating over the worst areas rather than properly repairing them. The weapon hardpoints were equally primitive, featuring large-bore kinetic cannons that belonged in a museum rather than a modern starship. "Fascinating," she murmured, dictating notes into the recording system. Human vessels appear to prioritize durability over elegance. Multiple redundant systems visible. Weapon configurations suggest they prefer direct engagement over tactical finesse. The humans had positioned themselves in the contested zone between the two fleets, a region of space that had seen countless battles over the past year. Both the Korthak and Velan forces maintained a wary distance, their weapon systems active but not yet targeting the newcomers. It was a temporary ceasefire that everyone knew wouldn't last long. Zexthera switched to communications monitoring and immediately regretted it. The human command frequency was chaos incarnate. Multiple voices overlapped each other, using crude terminology and what sounded like personal insults as standard military procedure. She struggled to make sense of their organizational structure until she realized they weren't using one. Instead of rigid hierarchies and formal protocols, they seemed to operate on a system of mutual respect and shared purpose that defied all established military doctrine. "This is Captain Sarah Chun of the U.S. Defiant." A female voice cut through the chatter with quiet authority. "All ships, final equipment checks. Remember, we're not here to win a war. We're here to end one." The response from the other ships was immediate and unified. "Understood, Captain." Zexthera felt a chill run through her exoskeleton. There was something in that simple exchange that spoke of absolute trust and unshakable resolve. These weren't the communications of soldiers following orders. They were the words of individuals who had chosen to risk everything for a cause they believed in. The tactical display showed both major fleets beginning to move. The Korthak Empire's crimson vessels accelerated toward the contested zone with their typical aggressive formation, while the Velan Confederacy's silver ships approached from the opposite vector in their preferred defensive pattern. The humans remained motionless in the center, apparently oblivious to the fact that they were about to be caught between two of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. "Human vessels, this is War Master Kreltalk of the Korthak 7th Fleet." A harsh voice crackled across the general communication channels. You have 30 seconds to vacate this system before we demonstrate why your species should have remained in its home nest. The human response came not from their captain, but from what sounded like a junior officer. War Master Krelltalk, this is Lieutenant Commander James Martinez of the U.S. Valiant. With respect, sir, we're not leaving until this stops. Zexthera had to replay the message 3 times to ensure she hadn't misunderstood. A junior officer had just politely but firmly refused the direct order of a war master whose fleet could reduce their entire force to component atoms. More importantly, he had addressed the alien commander with a formal title of respect despite being threatened. The Korthak response was predictably explosive. Insolent mammals! We shall feast on your bones while your ships burn around you. The Velan commander's communication followed immediately. Human fleet, I am Admiral HYSS Era of the Confederacy Defense Corps. We appreciate your optimism, but this is not a conflict that can be resolved through diplomacy. We suggest immediate withdrawal. Captain Chen's voice returned to the airwaves, calm and professional. Admiral War Master, we understand your positions and we respect your commitment to your people. But there has to be a better way than this endless cycle of destruction. We're asking for the chance to prove it. What happened next violated every principle of space combat that Zexthera had ever studied. Instead of responding with weapons fire or threats, both fleet commanders went silent. The human ships began moving, but not toward either fleet or away from the danger zone. They were spreading out in a complex pattern that seemed random until Zexthera realized what they were doing. The humans were positioning themselves directly between individual Korthak and Velan vessels, creating a living shield that would make it impossible for either side to fire without destroying the human ships first. It was the most insane tactical maneuver she had ever witnessed, and yet there was a terrible logic to it. All stations report ready, came the calm voice of Captain Chun. Remember, if they want to restart this war, they'll have to go through us first. Zexthera's recording equipment struggled to process what she was seeing. The humans had effectively made themselves hostages to prevent the resumption of hostilities. But they had done it with such precision and coordination that it could only have been planned in advance. They had studied both fleets, calculated the optimal positioning, and executed a maneuver that required absolute trust in every member of their force. The silence stretched for long minutes as both major fleets tried to process this unprecedented development. Their target acquisition systems couldn't lock onto enemy vessels without the human ships appearing in the firing solutions. More importantly, the humans had broadcast their entire conversation on open channels, making it clear to every crew member in both fleets that they were willing to die to prevent further bloodshed. This is irregular, Admiral HYSS Era finally transmitted. Human Captain, you cannot maintain this position indefinitely. Your supplies will run out, your crew will grow fatigued, and eventually we will resume our operations. Admiral, you're absolutely right, Captain Chun replied. We can't stay here forever. But we can stay here long enough to talk. All we're asking is for representatives from both sides to meet with us on neutral ground. One conversation. If we can't find a path forward, we'll withdraw and you can go back to destroying each other. The proposal hung in the void like a challenge. Zexthera found herself leaning forward, her recording equipment forgotten as she waited for the response. In all her years of observing primitive species, she had never seen anything like this. The humans weren't just risking their lives. They were betting everything on the possibility that two species who had been enemies for decades might be willing to listen to reason. War Master Krelltalk was the first to respond, and his voice carried none of his earlier aggression. Captain Chun, you speak of paths forward. What makes you believe that your species, who have known war for only moments compared to our conflict, could find solutions that have eluded us for years? The human captain's response revealed something that made Zexthera's recording equipment register peak emotional resonance across multiple frequencies. War Master, it's not because we're smarter or more advanced. It's because we're not invested in being right. We don't have centuries of grudges or territorial claims or blood debts to honor. All we have is the belief that beings who can build ships like yours and organize fleets like yours are smart enough to find a way to live without killing each other. The communication channels fell silent again. But this time the quality of the silence was different. It wasn't the tense quiet of impending violence. It was the contemplative pause of minds actually considering new possibilities. Admiral Techwesasera's next transmission carried undertones that Zexthera's analysis software tagged as curiosity rather than hostility. Captain, Assuming we agreed to this meeting, what assurances could you provide? How do we know this isn't some elaborate trick by your allies in the Korthak Empire? We don't have any allies, Captain Chun replied simply. 3 weeks ago, most of our people had never heard of either of your species. We came here because we monitored your distress calls and recognized the signs of a conflict that had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control it. Our only investment is in proving that there's always an alternative to mutual annihilation. The words hit Zexthara like a physical blow. These humans had traveled across interstellar space, risked their lives, and positioned themselves between two hostile fleets for people they had never met, in service of principles they couldn't even guarantee would work. It was the most fundamentally illogical and simultaneously noble gesture she had ever documented. Furthermore, Captain Chun continued, we're willing to provide hostages to ensure good faith. I and my senior staff will remain aboard a neutral vessel during any negotiations. If either side feels betrayed, you'll have our lives as compensation. The tactical displays showed movement in both fleets as commanders processed this offer. Hostage exchanges were common in galactic diplomacy, but they typically involved low-ranking personnel or prisoners of war. The humans were offering their most valuable individuals as guarantees of their sincerity. This is highly irregular, War Master Krelltalk transmitted, but his voice had lost its threatening edge. The Korthak Empire does not negotiate with weaklings or fools, yet your actions suggest neither. What species produces warriors willing to die for strangers? Captain Chen's laugh carried across the void, warm and genuinely amused. War Master, I'm not sure we're warriors in the way you mean. Most of my crew are explorers, scientists, engineers. But we've learned something important about survival. Sometimes the only way to preserve what you value is to risk everything to defend it. Zexthara realized she was holding her breath, an unconscious response her species exhibited during moments of extreme concentration. The humans had somehow transformed a 2-decade war into a philosophical discussion about the nature of courage and sacrifice. More incredibly, both enemy fleets were participating in that discussion rather than simply destroying the irritating interruption. The moment stretched until Admiral HFY broke the silence. Captain Chun, the Velan Confederacy is willing to consider a brief ceasefire for the purpose of preliminary discussions. However, we require guarantees beyond hostages. How do we know your people won't simply flee once negotiations begin? Admiral, you have our word, Captain Chun replied. But more than that, you have our ships. We've positioned ourselves so that any attempt to escape would require us to abandon our formations and expose both your fleets to each other. We literally cannot leave without giving you advance notice. It was true. The human fleet had committed itself so completely to maintaining the peace that they had eliminated their own escape routes. They were trapped by their own principles, unable to retreat without potentially triggering the very conflict they sought to prevent. The next series of transmissions revealed the true genius of the human approach. Rather than demanding grand gestures or immediate solutions, Captain Chun began asking simple questions about logistics, supply lines, and civilian populations. She wanted to understand what each side was actually fighting for rather than what they were fighting against. War Master Krelltalk, our sensors show massive resource extraction operations in your territory. Are these necessary for your people's survival? Or are they focused on war production? Admiral HFY, the Confederacy appears to maintain extensive defensive installations around non-military worlds. Are you protecting civilian populations or strategic assets? The questions were carefully neutral, but they forced both commanders to think about their goals rather than their grievances. More importantly, each answer revealed information that the other side found surprising. The Korthak were fighting to secure resources for their expanding population, while the Velan were trying to protect refugee camps from previous conflicts. Zexthara's analysis software began highlighting patterns in the communications that suggested both sides were beginning to realize their core objectives weren't mutually exclusive. The humans hadn't offered solutions. They had simply created a framework where actual communication could occur instead of ritual exchanges of threats and demands. Captain Chen, Admiral HFY transmitted after nearly an hour of careful questions and surprisingly detailed answers. The Confederacy is willing to participate in formal negotiations under the conditions you've outlined. We will provide a neutral vessel and accept your senior staff as hostages during the process. The response from the Korthak fleet came moments later. The Empire also agrees to these terms. However, We demand that any proposed solutions be subject to approval by both our war councils before implementation. Captain Chen's voice carried unmistakable relief and satisfaction. Thank you both. We'll begin preparations immediately. Admiral Warmaster, I want you to know that this is the first step toward something historic. Your grandchildren will remember this day as the moment their worlds chose hope over hatred. As the three fleets began the delicate process of arranging the meeting, Zexthara realized her initial assumptions had been completely wrong. The humans weren't going to be eliminated in the first day of combat because there wasn't going to be any combat. They had achieved something that trained diplomats and military strategists had declared impossible. They had convinced two bitter enemies to stop fighting long enough to remember why they had started. Her recording equipment had captured every moment of the exchange. But she knew the council would struggle to believe what they saw. The humans had demonstrated a form of courage that transcended simple bravery in battle. They had risked everything on the possibility that rational beings could choose cooperation over conflict, and somehow they had been proven right. As the Silent Watcher continued its silent vigil, Zexthara began to understand why she wished she had never been assigned to observe these particular humans. Because now she would have to return to the council and explain that everything they thought they knew about primitive species had just been proven catastrophically wrong. 3 days after the initial contact, Zexthara watched the most unusual diplomatic gathering in galactic history unfold aboard the human vessel designated UES Harmony. The ship itself defied every convention she understood about neutral meeting spaces. Instead of sterile conference rooms and formal protocols, the humans had created what they called a comfortable environment that somehow managed to accommodate the radically different physiological needs of 3 distinct species. The main conference area featured adjustable atmospheric controls for each delegation, furniture that could be reconfigured for different body types, and what the humans referred to as comfort foods from all 3 cultures. Most remarkably, Captain Chun had insisted that all security personnel remain outside the meeting space, leaving only the negotiators themselves in the room. Admiral HFY Sci-Fi had arrived first, her sleek silver uniform marking her as a career military officer despite her willingness to engage in diplomacy. The Velan were an elegant species, with elongated limbs and translucent skin that revealed the complex circulatory patterns beneath. Their delegation included both military and civilian representatives, suggesting they took the negotiations seriously. Warmaster Kreltalk's entrance had been characteristically dramatic. The Korthak were massive, heavily armored beings whose natural aggression had made them the dominant military force in this sector. Yet as he settled into the specially reinforced chair the humans had provided, Zexthara noticed something unexpected in his body language. The Warmaster was nervous. Captain Chun began the session with words that would have been impossible to translate just a week earlier. Thank you both for coming. Before we discuss territories or resources or any of the big issues, I want to talk about something smaller. I want to talk about home. The human captain activated a holographic projector that filled the center of the room with images from Earth. Rolling green hills, vast blue oceans, cities that sprawled across continents without visible defenses. Most striking were the images of human families. Children playing in parks, elderly couples sharing meals, young adults working together on projects that had nothing to do with war. This is where we come from, Captain Chun continued. A world that knew war for most of its history until we finally learned that our greatest achievements came when we worked together instead of against each other. I'm showing you this not because Earth is perfect, but because I want you to understand why we're here. Admiral Sarah leaned forward, her large eyes reflecting the blue skies of Earth. Captain, these images are peaceful. Your world appears to have no military installations, no defensive barriers around population centers. How do you protect your people? We protect them by making sure they don't need protection from each other, Captain Chun replied simply. Admiral Warmaster, I want to show you something else. The hologram shifted to display tactical readouts from the past week of conflict. The data showed refugee movements, supply line disruptions, and civilian casualties with clinical precision. But then, Captain Chun overlaid additional information that transformed the abstract numbers into personal tragedies. These aren't statistics, she said quietly. Every data point represents someone's family member, friend, or neighbor. Warmaster Kreltalk, 17% of your casualties last month were soldiers under the age of majority. Admiral Tefesasera, your refugee camps are housing children who have never seen their home worlds. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Both military leaders had access to the same casualty reports, but seeing them presented as individual lives rather than tactical losses created a different emotional impact. War Master Kreltalk spoke first, his voice lacking its usual aggressive tone. Captain, the Empire does not initiate conflicts for pleasure. Our expansion is necessary for our people's survival. The population grows, resources become scarce, and we must secure new territories to prevent starvation and economic collapse. Admiral HFY Sci's response revealed the depth of the misunderstanding that had fueled the conflict. War Master, the Confederacy was never trying to deny your people resources. Our defensive positions were designed to protect civilian populations from military expansion, not to prevent trade or resource sharing. The revelation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Captain Chun, however, treated it as an opportunity rather than an accusation. So the Empire needs resources and the Confederacy wants to protect civilians, she summarized. Those objectives don't have to be in conflict. Admiral, what would it take to provide safe passage for Korthak resource extraction while ensuring civilian populations remain secure? What followed was the most productive military discussion Zexthera had ever observed. Instead of demands and ultimatums, both sides began describing their actual needs with surprising specificity. The Korthak required access to rare minerals for their manufacturing processes and agricultural space for their growing population. The Velan needed guarantees that their civilian colonies wouldn't become military targets and that their trade routes would remain open. We could establish joint patrols, Admiral Tekvasasera suggested tentatively. Confederacy vessels could escort Korthak resource convoys to ensure they reach their destinations safely, while also verifying that no civilian areas are threatened. War Master Kreltalk's mandibles clicked in what Zexthera recognized as deep thought. Joint operations. This would require unprecedented cooperation between our forces. How would command structures function? What protocols would govern engagement with hostile forces? Captain Chun produced a datapad that she passed between both leaders. These are the operational frameworks that human peacekeeping forces have developed over the past century. Obviously, they would need to be adapted for your specific circumstances, but the basic principles have proven effective. The document outlined concepts that were revolutionary in galactic terms: shared command structures, integrated communication systems, and rules of engagement that prioritize de-escalation over force. More importantly, it provided detailed examples of how similar frameworks had been implemented between previously hostile human nations. Captain, Admiral Tekvasera said carefully, these protocols assume a level of trust between former enemies that seems optimistic. How do you convince soldiers who have been killing each other to suddenly work together? The human captain's smile carried a weight of experience that suggested she had faced this question before. Admiral, you don't start with the soldiers. You start with the reasons they're fighting. When people understand that their goals can be achieved without conflict, cooperation becomes a practical choice rather than an idealistic dream. To demonstrate her point, Captain Chun activated a new holographic display that showed resource distribution throughout the contested systems. Using current production data from both sides, she outlined a cooperative framework that would actually increase resource availability for both species while reducing the costs associated with constant warfare. The Korthak Empire currently spends approximately 60% of its industrial capacity on military production, she explained. The Velan Confederacy devotes similar resources to defensive systems. If those resources were redirected to productive activities, both societies would have access to significantly more wealth, food, and living space than they could ever capture through conquest. The mathematical projections were undeniable. Peaceful cooperation would provide both sides with more resources than either could obtain through military victory. More importantly, it would eliminate the enormous costs associated with maintaining wartime economies. War Master Kreltalk studied the data with the intense focus of a career military officer analyzing enemy positions. Captain, these projections assume that cooperation will continue indefinitely. What prevents either side from using the increased resources to build superior military forces and resume the conflict from a position of advantage? It was a logical question that revealed the depth of mistrust built up over decades of warfare. Captain Chen's response addressed both the practical and philosophical aspects of the concern. War Master, that's exactly why we're proposing graduated implementation with built-in verification systems. Nobody has to trust anybody completely on day one. We start with small cooperative projects that benefit both sides, build confidence through success, and gradually expand the scope of collaboration as trust develops. She activated another display showing a timeline for implementation that stretched over 5 standard years. The first phase involved joint patrols in small, contested sectors where success or failure would have limited impact on either side's overall position. Each subsequent phase built on the achievements of the previous one, creating a framework where betrayal would actually be counterproductive. Furthermore, Captain Chun continued, "We're proposing that Earth serve as a neutral guarantor for the initial phases. Any violation of the agreements would result in human intervention on behalf of the injured party." Admiral HFY reaction revealed the audacity of what Captain Chun was proposing. "Captain, you're offering to make your entire species responsible for maintaining peace between civilizations that could destroy Earth without significant effort. Why would you accept such enormous risk?" The human captain's response would later become legendary in galactic diplomatic circles. "Admiral, because the alternative is watching civilizations destroy themselves over problems that have solutions. We're not risking our lives for strangers anymore. We're investing in the kind of galaxy we want our children to inherit." The shift in perspective was subtle but profound. Captain Chun had reframed the discussion from risk management to legacy building, from short-term survival to long-term prosperity. Both military leaders found themselves thinking about consequences that extended beyond the next battle or the next territorial expansion. War Master Kreltalk requested a private consultation with his staff, while Admiral HFY did the same with her civilian advisors. The humans waited patiently, using the time to refine their proposals and answer technical questions about implementation details. When the session resumed, both delegations carried themselves differently. The defensive postures and aggressive signaling had been replaced by the focused attention of professionals examining a complex but potentially profitable business proposition. "Captain Chen," Admiral HFY began, "the Confederacy finds merit in your proposals, but we require additional guarantees regarding security during the transition period. How do we protect our civilian populations while military forces are being reorganized?" The question demonstrated how completely the discussion had shifted. Instead of debating whether cooperation was possible, they were negotiating the terms of implementation. "Admiral, we've anticipated that concern," Captain Chun replied, producing detailed security protocols that had clearly been prepared in advance. The proposal includes maintaining current defensive capabilities for all civilian areas while establishing the new cooperative frameworks. Nobody's security decreases during the transition period. War Master Kreltalk's questions focused on different aspects of the proposal. "Captain, the Empire requires assurance that resource access will not be subject to political manipulation by the Confederacy. How do we prevent economic warfare from replacing military conflict?" The answer revealed the sophisticated level of planning the humans had invested in their peacekeeping mission. "War Master, we're proposing that resource allocation be managed by joint committees with human observers. Any disputes would be arbitrated by neutral parties with no stake in the outcome except successful implementation of the agreements." As the hours passed, Zexthera watched something extraordinary unfold. 2 species that had been locked in bitter warfare were systematically dismantling the foundations of their conflict through careful negotiation and mutual problem-solving. The humans had somehow created an environment where former enemies could acknowledge their legitimate concerns while working together to address them. The breakthrough came when Admiral HFY made an observation that surprised everyone in the room. "War Master Kreltalk, reviewing your resource requirements and our defensive needs, it appears that many of our objectives could be achieved through joint development projects. Confederacy engineering expertise could help the Empire establish more efficient extraction operations, while Korthak industrial capacity could produce the defensive systems our civilian colonies require." The War Master's response revealed how completely the dynamic had changed. "Admiral, that is an intriguing possibility. Empire manufacturing capabilities are indeed underutilized for civilian purposes due to military priorities. Cooperative development could benefit both our peoples significantly." Captain Chun recognized the moment for what it was and moved quickly to capitalize on the progress. "Excellent. Let's outline a preliminary framework for joint development initiatives and see how it integrates with the security arrangements we've been discussing." By the end of the session, the 3 delegations had created the basic structure for what would become known as the Korvaxian Cooperative Accords. The agreement established joint patrols, integrated resource development, civilian protection protocols, and graduated implementation timelines with built-in verification and arbitration systems. More importantly, they had demonstrated that former enemies could work together to solve practical problems when they focused on shared interests rather than historical grievances. The humans had proven that their approach to conflict resolution could work even in the most challenging circumstances. As the delegations prepared to return to their respective fleets for consultation with higher authorities, War Master Kreltalk made a statement that would forever change how Zexthera understood the nature of warfare. Captain Chun, the Empire wishes to formally acknowledge that human intervention has revealed solutions that our military strategists failed to identify despite decades of analysis. Your people possess a form of tactical wisdom that transcends conventional military thinking. Admiral Thysera's farewell was equally significant. Captain, the Confederacy is grateful for your willingness to risk everything to help strangers find a path toward peace. Your actions represent the highest ideals of galactic civilization. As the UES Harmony began the process of implementing the preliminary agreements, Zexthera realized that her mission parameters had become completely irrelevant. She was no longer observing primitive humans in combat because there wasn't going to be any combat. Instead, she was documenting the emergence of a new paradigm for interspecies relations that would reshape the entire galaxy. 2 weeks into the implementation of the preliminary agreements, Zexthera began to understand why experienced observers were requesting reassignment rather than continue monitoring human peacekeeping operations. The sheer unpredictability of their methods challenged every established principle of galactic relations, yet their success rate defied all statistical models. The first joint patrol had launched 3 days earlier, consisting of 2 Korthak heavy cruisers, 3 Velan escort vessels, and 1 human coordination ship. Standard military doctrine suggested such a formation would collapse into internecine warfare within hours. Instead, Zexthera's sensors were detecting something unprecedented. The mixed fleet was actually becoming more efficient as the crews learned to work together. Captain Chan had insisted on what she called cross-training exchanges, where personnel from each species spent time aboard the other fleet's vessels. The concept had been met with suspicion and outright hostility from both military commands, but the human captain had been persistent in her usual diplomatically aggressive manner. War Master Admiral, she had argued during one of their daily coordination calls, your people are going to be working together for years. They need to understand each other's capabilities, limitations, and standard procedures. More importantly, they need to realize that their former enemies are just people trying to do their jobs and protect their families. The first exchange had been a disaster. A young Korthak engineer assigned to a Velan vessel had accidentally triggered a security alert when he misunderstood their containment protocols. The Velan crew had responded with what they considered appropriate caution, but what the Korthak interpreted as aggressive detention. Within minutes, both fleets were at elevated alert status and demanding explanations. Captain Chen's response had been to immediately transport herself to the affected Velan vessel and personally escort the Korthak engineer through the proper procedures. More importantly, she had required the Velan security chief and the Korthak's immediate supervisor to work together to develop new protocols that would prevent similar misunderstandings. Look, she had told them with her characteristic directness, you're going to make mistakes. All of us are. The question is whether we're going to use those mistakes as excuses to give up or as opportunities to build better systems. The revised protocols became a template for integration procedures throughout the joint fleet. More significantly, the process of developing them forced representatives from both species to spend hours together solving practical problems. By the time they finished, the former enemies had begun to develop genuine professional respect for each other's expertise. Zexthera had documented the entire process, but she knew her reports were being met with skepticism by the Council's analytical staff. The humans weren't just preventing conflict. They were actively transforming the relationship between species that had been bitter enemies for decades. The breakthrough came during the joint fleet's first encounter with hostile forces. A group of raiders had been exploiting the chaos of the Korthak-Velan conflict to attack civilian shipping in the border regions. When the integrated patrol encountered them, every established tactical doctrine suggested the mixed fleet would be unable to coordinate an effective response. Instead, Zexthera watched the most innovative military operation she had ever observed. The Korthak vessels provided heavy firepower and defensive screening, while the Velan ships used their superior speed and sensors to coordinate targeting and pursuit. The human vessel served as a communications hub, translating tactical instructions between the different command styles and ensuring all 3 fleets operated as a unified force. The raiders were neutralized within minutes. But the real victory was what happened afterward. Instead of arguing about credit or salvage rights, the joint fleet immediately began coordinating rescue operations for the damaged civilian vessels they had been protecting. Korthak engineers worked alongside Velan medical teams while human logistics specialists organized the evacuation of injured crew members. Captain Chen's after-action report had been characteristically modest. Joint Patrol successfully completed first mission with no friendly casualties and minimal collateral damage. All participating vessels performed according to expectations. Recommend expanding cross-training programs based on observed synergies between different tactical approaches. The understated language concealed the revolutionary nature of what had occurred. For the first time in galactic history, 3 distinct species with incompatible military doctrines had seamlessly integrated their forces to protect civilians and defeat a common threat. Warmaster Kreltalk's response had revealed how completely his perspective had changed. Captain Chen, the Empire formally requests additional human coordination vessels for future joint operations. Your people's ability to facilitate interspecies cooperation provides tactical advantages that significantly exceed the nominal capabilities of your individual ships. Admiral Tefesacera had been equally enthusiastic. Captain, the Confederacy wishes to establish permanent exchange programs with both human and Korthak forces. Our crews have learned more about effective military cooperation in 2 weeks than in 20 years of independent operations. The success of the joint patrols accelerated implementation of the other aspects of the Korvaxian Cooperative Accords. Resource development projects that had been scheduled for gradual introduction were suddenly being fast-tracked as both sides recognized the practical benefits of collaboration. The first joint mining operation had been established in a contested asteroid belt that both sides had been fighting over for 3 years. Instead of dividing the resources, the humans had proposed a shared extraction facility that would provide materials for both the Korthak industrial expansion and the Velan defensive construction projects. Zexthara's analysis of the operation revealed the elegant sophistication of human problem-solving. Rather than simply splitting the asteroid belt between the two sides, they had designed an integrated facility that actually increased total resource extraction while reducing the costs for both parties. Korthak heavy mining equipment worked in partnership with Velan precision processing systems, while human logistics coordination ensured efficient distribution of extracted materials. More importantly, the joint facility required ongoing cooperation between the two species' industrial specialists. Engineers and technicians who had been designing weapons to kill each other were suddenly working together to optimize production efficiency and develop new extraction techniques. The human approach to civilian protection had proven equally innovative. Instead of maintaining separate defensive systems, they had proposed integrated protection networks that covered all civilian populations in the region regardless of species affiliation. Captain Chun had explained the concept with her usual directness. Protecting people shouldn't depend on which government they belong to.